Government funding cuts are putting some of the world's most vulnerable people at risk of hunger and malnutrition. The United Nations World Food Program issued a strong warning recently, saying that an additional 24 million people could slip into emergency hunger in the next year, a 50% increase from the current level. So far, the organization has received less than half of the $25 billion it says it needs to prevent starvation. And operations have been slashed in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Earlier this year, conflict forced Khulud Khair to flee Sudan. Now she's trying to get help for people in her home country.
I don't think there's a proper recognition of just how severe things are in Sudan and just how urgent the needs are. There is an overemphasis on the Ukrainian conflict to the detriment of other conflicts. And often what that means is that funding envelopes that are made available for Ukraine are not utilized in the same way for other countries, including Sudan.
Members of the UN Security Council recently met to discuss the problem and are calling on the private sector to do more.
This moment calls for bold action. It calls for breaking out of our business as usual model. It calls for thinking holistically about how we address increasingly protracted crises. And it calls for everyone.
Ending poverty and hunger are supposed to be the United Nations' top priorities under the Sustainable Development Goals, but the trends are all moving in the wrong direction. Humanitarians blame conflict, climate change, and the enduring impacts of the COVID pandemic.
There are more than 340 million people worldwide facing acute food insecurity. Some 40 million of them are already at emergency levels of hunger.
Cuts at this magnitude have consequences. And those consequences are not just for people who may lose their lives or their livelihoods.
This is the first time in the organization's 60-year history that it's seen such significant shortfalls. The worry now is that more hungry people will only lead to more global instability. Kristen, Saloomey, Al Jazeera, the United Nations.
Now, Khan Ross is founder of the non-profit advisory group Independent Diplomat. Joins us by Skype from Deganwy in the United Kingdom. Good to have you with us, sir. So first of all, how can funding be raised in a cash-strapped post-COVID world?
That's a very good question. With the cost of living crisis across the world and affecting places like the United States and the European Union, I don't see much prospect for extra cash being raised for sustainable development, climate transition, or anything else. I think the money can only be raised by mobilizing private sector funds, the enormous amount of savings and investment funds that dwell in the global north. We need to find a way of shifting that money to the global south for development and the climate transition.
If communities are increasingly becoming hungry, what does that mean for the world? More political instability, more crime, more migration?
I'm willing to attribute particular phenomena to the terrible phenomena of poverty and hunger, but certainly one consequence will surely be an increase in migration. The world is facing a rapid increase in the amount of migration. Last year, the High Commissioner for Refugees of the UN said there were about 110 million refugees, of whom about 60 million were climate refugees fleeing from places where the environment has become unbearable. That number will only increase, and surely hunger and poverty will only increase. A good example is the number of people fleeing Venezuela, which is in a disastrous economic condition. There is real hunger, and people are fleeing north in vast numbers.
There have been calls at the United Nations Security Council for the private sector to do more to fill this gap as countries cut back on their budgets. What do you make of that argument?
I don't love the argument because I think governments themselves should have done more. There should be more global leadership to reach out and help the poorer parts of the world to develop and to make the climate transition to renewable energy. But I don't see that happening politically. And in the absence of government action, I do think we have to turn to the private sector and look at how to so-called de-risk investments in the private sector in the developing world but also de-risk investment in the renewable energy transition, which needs to happen on a global scale.
All right, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.